listening to How We Got Here. I'm Christina Best, and I am joined by super producer Bill Oddman. Also, what?
Hi, Christina.
Hi. What am I doing?
Hi.
Doing this intro. What is happening?
I don't know. This is weird.
This is very weird.
This is weird. But Chris had a death in the family, and one of his sisters, his closest sister, and so he's not able to be with us right now. But I know that our thoughts are with him and with the family. And all of that, I think he'd appreciate knowing that. So, and I'm sure he'll be back soon.
Absolutely. So, yeah, if you think about it, you know where to find Chris on social media. Show him some love. I know he would be really appreciative of it.
Right. He needs some love. So you get me.
Yeah. So you get Bill.
Oh my God.
Bill instead. Wild card Bill, as we call him.
I am so excited. Oh my God. I'm so excited.
This is going to be a great conversation. And by the way, if you do like today's conversation, as always, we need to remind you to please subscribe, or at least consider subscribing, rating and reviewing our podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts. So yes, we've got a Chris size absence in today's episode, but
and if you remember from our our last episode in season 1, I was on that episode.
Oh yes, you guys may remember Bill from our recap. That's
right, and Chris talked about my keen insights.
Oh, yeah.
Do you remember that discussion about keen insights?
God. Yes. So
here we go.
Here we go again. Keen insights will abound on this episode, no doubt. Well, without further ado, I have decided to give Bill the honors. Being the very generous host that I am, I've decided to give him the honors of reading our guest's bio today. So, Bill, are you ready? Are you ready to do it?
I'm not worthy. I'm not worthy. Of course. Christina and I both are thrilled that we're able to have Tina Tchen with us today. Tina Tchen is an attorney, activist, and lifelong advocate for women and girls. She served in the Obama White House through both terms and was an assistant to President Barack Obama, chief of staff to First Lady Michelle Obama, and executive director of the White House Council on Women and Girls. In 2017, she helped design and launch the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund. She also served as president and CEO of Time's Up Now and the Time's Up Foundation, and instituted the Time's Up Care Economy Business Council. Tina is currently founder and principal of Seneca Strategies, LLP, and serves as a senior advisor to the Girls' Opportunity Alliance at the Obama Foundation, as a co-chair of the United State of Women, and on the board of Civic Nation. Tina Tchen, welcome to How We Got Here.
Oh, I'm delighted to be here.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us. Truly an impressive bio that probably, if we had read the whole thing, would have taken the entire episode to read. But I don't think anyone needs us to just read your bio. So instead, as we ask all of our guests, Tina, how did you get here? Tell us more.
Well, part of the reason it's long, Christine, is that I'm just really old, right? So when you're old, things, kind of stretch out.
Sure.
Yeah, so that's part of it. But, look,
Tina, you're only a few years older than me, so so come on.
Well, I've been learning all about the ins and outs of the Medicare system lately, so that's how that places you a little bit on how old I am.
Yeah, we're in open enrollment season.
Yep. And it's kind of new for me. So just learning about that. It is one of those things where you wonder how, I've got a lot of degrees under my belt, and I'm still haven't taken a long time figuring it out,
Sure.
How everyone is able to navigate these.
It's a quagmire. It's a quagmire.
Wow, I think that is the first time we've used that word on this show, by the way. I just needed to point that out.
I specialize in multisyllabic words, so...
But the quick version, and I don't mean to go all the way back to the beginning, but I do think it's important to note, I always think about my parents, when I get the question, how did I get here? Because I am the daughter of 2 Chinese immigrants to the United States, really 2 refugees, because my parents came here unexpectedly in 1949, fleeing the civil war going on in China. And interestingly my mother came in as a student, on a student visa. My dad came in on a visitor visa, having completed his medical school training in China, but came in on a visitor visa and started to do his residency. And when the communist takeover happened in China, all the student visas were automatically converted to green cards. But the visitor visas for my dad required a special act of Congress where his name is actually, he and other similarly, situated folks, were part of a bill that then Senator Bricker from Ohio, where we were living, sponsored. And I say that because it was a really different time, right? The United States was welcoming these immigrants and refugees to come to the United States and to help them on a path to citizenship. And it's such a change, right? To where we are today. I grew up in suburban Cleveland, Ohio, because my dad actually decided not to settle on either coast, New York or California, because of the discrimination against Asians that he'd heard about from friends and family. So he literally set us in a place where there were no Chinese. I think there were literally only six families.
Was it Shaker Heights? Is that what I remember?
I was just east of Shaker Heights, Beechwood,
okay.
Ohio.
Yeah, I'm from Aurora, so I was going to be very excited to make the Ohio connection here. Quite familiar.
Exactly.
With Beechwood.
Beechwood, Ohio, just east of, just one more suburb over from the city, from next to Shaker Heights. But literally the whole east side of Cleveland, rather, probably only had 6 Chinese families at the time in the 50s and 60s when I was growing up. And then, I went, after college, I married somebody, that I met in college, who was from Illinois, which is how I wound up, really my adult life has been spent. And I consider myself a Chicagoan now, having lived in Chicago for over 45 years, went to law school here in Chicago, worked for state government for a while, which was in a heady time in Springfield, Illinois, and that was how I got my lifelong, commitment to women's issues, because I spent my early 20s in Springfield, Illinois, when it was the hotbed of American feminism, when we were trying to pass the Equal Rights Amendment, and everybody came to town. That's how Phyllis Schlafly, if people have seen Mrs. America, that's how she got her start on the anti-ERA side in Illinois. But people like Ellie Smeal and Gloria Steinem, everybody came to Illinois because we needed it as the only northern and industrial state that had never passed the ERA. It did just pass the ERA about 3 years ago, but it took 40 years to get it done. But that was my introduction to feminism and to reproductive rights and to sexual harassment and sexual assault. And I continued that work as an officer of Illinois Now while I was in law school. And then throughout as my volunteer work while I was a corporate lawyer for 20 years at Skadden Arps, and political work, always did political work. So that's how I happened to meet this interesting guy running for political office as a young politician on the south side of Chicago, and became, friends with he and his wife, Barack and Michelle Obama, and Valerie Jarrett and I knew each other from the Harold Washington days together. And so I was always a supporter of his. And it's sort of remarkable when a friend of yours becomes president of the United States and then asks you to go to the White House, because that's how I got there. Wow. So that's sort of the quick, back and forth filling in, some of those gaps from Bill's, quick introduction to where I got to today.
Yeah.
I personally, when I've been thinking about, women's rights and sexual harassment and the treatment of women in the workplace and the challenges that I know we're going to be discussing as part of this episode when it comes to caregiving, particularly for women, and what's happened with that, particularly in the pandemic, right? That I was just reflecting on that history that, because I remember the Equal Rights Amendment stuff. I grew up in Los Angeles, but remember that very clearly. I came to Missouri in 1980, and after much of it I had already kind of finished, but it just all of that, and then the continual, and you're right, 40 years, right? It took 40 years for us to, and we're still talking about all of this. That's really kind of the keen insight that I had. It's like we're still talking about that.
Insight number one.
No, I think the insight there is that cultural change like this takes a very, very long time.
It does.
But it also takes constant attention, Well,
I often say, look, gender discrimination, you got to remember, it's been around for millennia.
Right.
It's like literally written into the Bible. It's biblical in its scope. It transcends time and geography and race and religion and culture, right? Go any place around the world and you're going to find, gender discrimination happening, right? In all manner of places. And that's what we're up against. So yeah, it's going to take us a while, and it changes slow and hard, but means you got to stay at it.
How do you find the resilience to stay at it? I have to ask.
Yeah, no, look, it's hard. On the one hand, the work is hard. You get some wins. We're in the middle of, obviously, a fight for our lives on abortion when we thought we had a win, in 1973 with Roe v. Wade. And now we look like we're on the verge of losing it altogether as a constitutional right, which I think is, happening in Texas. It's, whatever the Supreme Court's going to do as these cases come through. And so it's, a little bit of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. The resilience, though, the other thing about doing political work that I say is that the secret behind it is you make some of the best friends of your life in doing that work because you have a shared vision and a shared commitment. You go through a lot of things together. And so, the women that, for example, there was a group of us that rewrote the Illinois rape laws in 1984 after we lost the ERA and passed that. And those women are still my best friends to this day. Our Obama folks, we are still an Obama family. I talk about it all the time. We're 5 years out from being in office, and we all still show up for each other, whether somebody's running for office, whether somebody's getting married, or somebody's having a baby. It's another part of my family. And that's some of where the resilience and the inspiration comes from, is you make these relationships in the movement that sustain you and keep you.
Yeah. So, sounds a lot like caregiving to me. We have such a strong caregiving community, especially family caregivers who share their stories with one another and connect over their experiences, and then just stay in touch and find strength in that.
No, absolutely. And I think we need to do more of that, because I think caregiving is often the unseen, right? And unspoken about part of our lives, and we don't recognize it for what it is in terms of the importance that it is, the sacrifice by people who are caregivers. And I think it's relatively new, this idea that caregiving is a profession. Caregiving is an activity we need to invest in, and we need to invest in caregivers, whether they're paid or unpaid, and that we need to create those connections for them, which is why, all the work that the Care Can't Wait Coalition has been doing, caring across generations, this current moment that we are in, that I think is really critical on the caregiving front, transformational moment unlike any we have seen up until this point in our history, is really critical and really important.
Yeah.
So on that note, I know that what I'd like to do is at some point I'd like to wrap back around to your own experience of caregiving with your family. But since we're kind of, at this juncture in the conversation where we're talking about policy and about what you're currently doing, and actively engaged with right now, I know that I had mentioned in the bio that you'd formed up the Care Economy Business Council when you were, part of Time's Up. I was wondering how you've kind of carried that vision forward into the work that you're doing, today, because, you remain a very busy lady, right? So I'd be interested to know how you kind of carried that forward, and maybe what some of the climate, probably not the right word, but kind of what that climate is for caregiving. Now the Biden administration has, earlier in the year announced that they were going to be doing more for caregiving in terms of funding. So that was a really poorly formed question.
I know, but I think I got it.
All right.
I got it.
So,
well, let me start with where you ended, which is the climate, because I do think we are at a transformational moment, and they don't come often. And sometimes you don't always recognize them. I once saw Gloria Steinem answer a question where some young person had asked her, what do you do and how do you know when you're in a transformational moment? And she said, well, you don't often know. And so you should live every moment like you're in a transformational moment. I would say, however, in this moment, we have the luxury of knowing we are absolutely in a transformational moment. We don't have to guess at it. And I believe it started before the pandemic, because I saw companies, even in, the couple of years leading up to the moment the pandemic hit, companies realizing they needed to pay attention to diversity and inclusion. There was a war for talent going on. They needed to have more women and people of color in their companies, no matter what the industry was, across the board. And then in the pandemic hit, I will tell you, I had a moment early on in the pandemic, and that was when I was president and CEO of Time's Up, where I was really worried, because in the early days of the pandemic, as the economy was going south, things like diversity and inclusion are often the first things to go, right? But, and I think it was a confluence of the George Floyd tragedy, which reawakened everybody's awareness around race discrimination in this country, and the need for talent, and all of a sudden the economic recovery and people needing to make sure that they actually got workers back, coming, and what even CEOs had to experience working from home and Zoom schooling. They couldn't just go off and ignore the chaos happening in their own homes with their own kids, or on the screen with their workers, families, running around in the background. We are now at a moment where I think everyone from CEOs to policymakers understand how critical caregiving is, not just because it's what you should do for workers and how important it is for individual families, but how critical it is to make our economy work, right? We've seen all the figures, and the CEOs know it. Something to the tune of 3 million women left the workforce during the pandemic permanently because of caregiving. We have women's labor force participation is at levels we have not seen since the 1980s. So in the last year and a half, we wiped out 30 years of progress of women coming into the workforce, of being able to succeed in businesses, provide more for their families. 2/3 of the children in the United States, remember, and this is pre-pandemic, lived in households where either there was a single caregiver, single parent, so that, you had a single breadwinner, or both parents were having to go to work. So 2/3 of America's children already live in families where you need caregiving, to make that family work every day. And yet we are alone. Let's be clear. Among the industrialized nations in the world, the United States is alone in how we think about caregiving. We just think about it as unpaid labor, as something that isn't, for public policymakers to invest in. It is a legacy of slavery. It goes back to the moment where caregiving was done by the house slaves, and you didn't pay for it. And then that's why in the 1930s, when the New Deal was passed and job and labor protection, came in for all the other workers, domestic workers were left out. And it carries through to AFDC, when we were actually paying mothers to stay home in our aid to families and dependent children, in the 60s, and to Richard Nixon, who vetoed the last opportunity we had to provide for universal child care in this country, because he thought it was, perhaps going to lead to the Sovietization of American children. And you see that argument happening today. So let me bring you current to your their question, Bill, which is what's happening in this moment. We have an opportunity where companies, that's why 350 companies joined the Care Economy Business Council, because they realize if they want to keep workers, they need to invest in their workforce. And public policymakers, especially the Biden administration, that has put on the table historic investments to expand childcare, to expand disabled care, to expand wage and hour protections for caregivers, and to finally give us a national paid leave program, which again, we are one of only 2 countries in the world that has no national paid leave program of any kind. And that's what's known as the reconciliation bill, or the Build Back Better bill, whatever the name is. Those are the kinds of policies that are on the table in front of Congress right now. And so we have this historic opportunity to really change that uniquely American disregard for caregiving that we have had historically, to really invest. And it will be critical, as I said, not just for individual families, but when every other country is doing these investments, they're going to sprint ahead of us in the global economy as we move forward if we don't address this now. And we're at the moment, this very week the podcast is airing, where Congress is got these issues on the table. They're talking about how they're going to downsize the top line number in the reconciliation bill. I am very concerned because on the list that people keep talking about taking off the table, childcare is one of them, which to me makes no sense because it is clear if we want more workers back in the workforce, when you've got restaurant owners and Walmart and everyone else saying they don't have enough workers, clearly we need childcare on the table, as well as paid leave, as well as disabled care. That's what's going to get the economy going. And so I want all the listeners to understand what's in this bill that's getting debated right now and make your voice heard, right? Call your member of Congress, call your senator. You can use the hashtag Care Can't Wait, which is the hashtag for the Care Can't Wait Coalition, that is doing this work, and tell your story. As you pointed out, Christina, telling the stories of caregivers and what your particular caregiving challenge is now or has been in your life, maybe when you were a child even, is important for people to hear and to know, and for policymakers. And this is a moment where everybody in the country can have a role in making sure that we actually make the investments in caregiving that we need to get made right now.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know, Christine, if you want to follow up with a...
Well, I do have a question, maybe not related to everything Tina just said specifically, and this is just from my naivety of not being in politics or anything. But what are, if you can shed some insight or light on what are the conversations like in Washington about topics like this, about funding? What does that look like? Because for the average person, I feel like that's just like a black box. We know people are in Washington talking about these things. What does that actually look like? Either collaboration or, people disagreeing on things. I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, well, it is a black box. Washington is really opaque to the rest of the country. And I learned that when I went to Washington. I was a reasonably political person before I, went to the Obama White House in January of 2009. And then I got to DC and I realized, oh my God, I had no idea what was really going on in Congress. And because it is, it's a little hidden, and it's a little, there's a lot of, bureaucratic lingo that gets used. But the debate right now, revolves around a couple of things. First of all, the Biden administration, to their credit, put a very ambitious Build Back Better agenda on the table. So it wasn't just about caregiving. That was a big part of it, but it also included things like universal pre-kindergarten, about free community college, because we need that to get people back to work. They put an ambitious climate change package together too, right? Incentives for people to convert to electric cars and to go to clean energy, because clearly, as we see from the fires and the floods going on across the country, climate change is real and we need to address it. But that all comes with a big price tag, right, on how much public sector, federal dollar investment do we need to make. And so, the Biden administration also put on the table, a modest, in my view, increase in corporate taxes, and in taxes on the very, very rich. They have not proposed any taxes on anybody who is middle class, but on the very, very rich who, clearly are not paying their fair share because they have lots of tax shelters that they can use, as we've seen in the recent news. But if they paid even just 1 or 2 percentage points more, you could fund all of these things. And that's the debate. There are people who don't want to raise taxes at all, who are very worried about that. There are some people who, are invested in not clean energy. There's that. And then there are people who just think we need to do fewer things, and that's why things like childcare gets put on the table. We can't do all of these things. We need to only do some of them, and pass them. And it's complicated by the fact that the Democrats have to do it all on their own. It is clear that even though these are policies that will benefit everyone. Look, the caregiving crisis doesn't just exist in blue states, right? It exists in red states and red communities, in families that voted for Donald Trump, as well as families that voted for Joe Biden. And these are policies that will benefit everyone. But for whatever reason, the Republicans in Congress have decided that they are not going to engage to help on any of these, and have said whatever happens has to be done only by Democratic votes. The Democrats have a very, very slim majority, only 5 votes in the House, and it's a 50-50 even split with Vice President Harris casting the tie-breaking vote in the U.S. Senate.
Well, in my own observation about the dynamics within the Democratic Party itself, And I'd sooner walk on my lips.
And we're a big tent.
I'd sooner walk.
Democrats, so we cover the waterfront.
I'd sooner walk on my lips than make a political remark on this podcast. However, I'm reminded of the multiple times that the Democrats, or the few times I should say, that the Democrats have had a majority in both the House and the Senate in my lifetime, and it always seems like it's this. Although I didn't feel quite this way this time around, but it always seems like there's this honeymoon period. And with the president, Democratic president, Democratic Congress, or democratically controlled Congress, and then suddenly that honeymoon ends because for whatever reason the Democrats have a real hard time trying to come together on things themselves.
Oh, yes.
So that was the long way. Right. That's the long way around. It for a while there earlier this year, I was very concerned that it seemed like, and I still am somewhat concerned that, the party itself is having its own internal struggles, and they're just going to have to get over it.
Yeah.
Which is easy for me to say, but it's like.
But the challenges are real because we have, some of our majority is built on the fact that we have a lot of Democrats who, including some, friends of mine who were, won in very, barely purple districts here in Illinois, right? That are conservative,
right. Yep.
Used to be Republican districts, where suburban, women largely have really realized that they need to sort of vote Democratic on the issues that they care about. And so, those moderates are worried, about how they get, reelected and sustain our majority. While you've got progressives, who obviously also have the issues that they care about. I will say caregiving is one of those, not to take away from, my brothers and sisters who do climate action work or right. Or other work.
No, absolutely. Right.
Caregiving is the one that really universally is going to be felt immediately by people across the board, and people understand it. And I do think that that's why this is a critical moment for anybody who's listening to make their voice heard. Moms Rising, if you go to the Moms Rising website, for example, momsrising.org, you can put in your zip code and they will patch you directly through to your member of Congress so that you can, place a phone call or send an email to that member of Congress to make your voice heard, about, how you care about these issues. And this is a moment where actually people count that. That's important. People don't realize that members of Congress, they do tallies, on these issues. They know how many calls came in for this issue, how many calls came in on that issue. You should even call your blue state. If you live in a blue state, don't ignore your blue state member of Congress or senator, because they need to hear it too. And they're the ones who are weighing, do I get more calls on climate, or am I getting more calls on caregiving today? So I would urge everyone to no matter where you live or where you are, to make your voice heard.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think that's a great message, and really a great message for anyone, regardless of your party affiliations. I feel very passionate about this because, I think that it's only within the last few years that I've really become aware of, kind of at a visceral level, the idea that all politics is local, right? Regardless of what is happening in Washington, D.C., and an awful lot happens in Washington, D.C., we get it, but really it is driven at a local level, and the one thing that's really been come to light for me as well is this belief that, and it's a belief that many people have shared. I think I shared at one time, that my voice doesn't really matter in the larger, scheme of things. And my voice alone probably doesn't matter in the greater scheme of things. But when it's put together with other voices that are saying the same thing, or at least similar things, then it does matter. And so I think that's why this message, Tina, that you've just shared with us, is so important for people to hear, regardless of whether you're blue state, red state. It doesn't really matter. If you want your voice heard, you need to do that as part of a collective that's doing that, right? And that's how that's heard, and that often starts locally, and it often certainly should start in the home, in my humble opinion.
Well, I will say, it is a moment where don't discount. It is absolutely true. People at banding together, around issues, which is why actually being able to use hashtags like, care can't wait is such a great hashtag. Organizing tool. But I wouldn't discount your individual voice as a constituent. Calling a member of Congress, give your address so they know you really live in the district, makes a huge difference and can really, your story could be the story that resonates, with that member or answers a question they're getting from somebody who's on the other side, or is a story they can tell as they're in negotiations, right? And reflect back, well, I heard from a member, one of my constituents and they had this problem. So, we really can't take away wage protections for caregiver because they were a caregiver who's living on the poverty line right now, even though they're caring for someone. Right. So I think this is how the beauty of our democracy is that actually and is endangered as it is, which is like a whole other podcast. But
right.
But as endangered as it is, there is a beauty to it that it is very direct, and participatory. If we will just do it, right? It does require as citizens for us to pick up that phone or send that email.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's a good tie into a comment I wanted to make, tying back to what you said about climate change, which obviously is like, I mean, in my opinion, especially being of a younger generation and the projections of how climate change is already affecting, our daily life and will in the future. It's very important. But so I see everything happening on the stage of climate change at this point. But if we're not addressing caregiving, which is the root of all things, is caring for one another, taking care of one another, then people don't have their time and resources, their mental capacity freed up to be thinking about the issues that really matter, like being more conscious consumers, though I don't mean to imply that the climate change can be solved on the individual level. That's not what I'm endorsing. But, it does free up the opportunity for people to make more of those individual decisions about their consumption habits. It allows them to be more politically involved because they're being taken care of and not being, I don't know if the right word is distracted by the caregiving they're doing, but I guess being entrenched with caregiving and just figuring out their day to day, it frees up their time and mental capacity to be more engaged and thoughtful.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, they're not worried about where the next meal is coming from or how they're going to pay rent this month or because they aren't working because they're caregiving, right? Yeah.
Right,
so it's
or whether your kids are safe when they come home from school or
all of that.
Yeah.
I think this is a very powerful topic, and I'm so glad that we have you to talk about it, Tina. Something I'd like to do is ask you. See, I'm really being the wild card, aren't I, Christina?
Yeah,
Christina's
you're being great.
What's he doing now?
Where
am I going now? But I'm really curious to know then, because I think it's interesting. I didn't associate myself. Okay, and I'll acknowledge. Okay, I'm the token guy on the conversation, right? I'm as gay as a goose, but I'm still the token guy. I'm the white, privileged, whatever person who's on the podcast. But I share these concerns both as a gay person and then as someone who has experienced caregiving firsthand and am associated now with so many people who are involved in caregiving on a daily basis, mostly women. Was surprised to learn. But Tina, to your passion for the topic, because as I think about the work that you were doing with women in the workplace and all that kind of business. And Christine and I were talking about, having you on to talk about caregiving. I'm kind of like, well, wait a minute, where does that fit into this? And then suddenly, it came to light that you were working in Time's Up with, trying to, because you realized how many women were basically being displaced from the workplace by caregiving because of COVID. The pandemic sort of brought all that to light. Where does your passion come from for caregiving? Maybe it's the better way to ask the question. Now that I've said all that.
Yeah. No, my passion, I guess, comes from a lot of different places and has evolved over time. I guess sort of like the national view has evolved over time. It has been lifelong, actually, and I'm not sure I really related it until recently, how much my childhood was also shaped by caregiving. Because when I was very young in elementary school, my mother was diagnosed with a really chronic, debilitating disease. She had rheumatoid arthritis in a very aggressive form, and so became pretty physically incapacitated for most of my, childhood. And so we had a whole, series of wonderful different caregivers coming into our home to help raise my sister and I and care for us. And I'm not sure I fully appreciated them as caregivers, or saw it through that lens until I've done this work, politically. What I did recognize and know at the time it was happening was, as a corporate lawyer, as I was before the White House for 2 decades, and then working in the White House, which was a pretty demanding environment, I was a single mother of 2. I, raised 2 kids on my own. And although I had means, because I was a lawyer, so I was able to, hire in-home, childcare for my kids. It was still hard. It's hard to find the right person when there's gaps, when somebody isn't available. There is a part of your brain that is occupied by worrying about your children, even as you're, at work. And I often thought at the time that how can someone on a minimum wage job do this when I'm barely holding it together as a lawyer at a big law firm? And so when I got to the White House, and I was executive director of the White House Council of Women and Girls, and Valerie Jarrett was the chair, and she was also a single working mom her whole career. And the Obamas were, remember, 2 young working parents, right, with both, parents in the household raising young children, in what they were doing when they got to the White House. All 4 of us shared a passion for how do we address working families. And that's how we really came to work a great deal on a working families agenda, like, trying to advocate for paid leave. And when we couldn't get it through the Congress, then doing what we could as a federal employer, within, we provided leave to the federal employees that were responsible to the president because we could control them, but we couldn't do it for the rest of the federal employees without an act of Congress. And holding things like the first ever White House Summit on Working Families. And what we were able to do with that, and I have to say that I had great support from the economists, like people like Jason Furman and folks who worked for us, Betsy Stevenson, because we started to put the economic analysis together that is now pretty well accepted, but wasn't at the time in 2009, that if you invest in working families issues like paid leave and caregiving and flexible scheduling and equal pay, you actually will build more profitable businesses, right? That it contributes to the bottom line in a positive direction. It's not just a cost item. And that's now pretty well accepted out there, but it wasn't at the time. And we were able to use the bully pulpit of the president's platform to push that forward and bring us to this current moment, which is, as we've talked about before, I think that argument's pretty well accepted, but companies still don't know exactly how to do it. So that's one of the things the Times Up Care Economy Business Council was formed, was to actually help businesses figure out how to provide caregiving, in a cost-effective way, and how to actually provide that benefit for their employees, because it's a new era of companies actually caring about the caregiving demands on their employees, not just having their employees figure it out on your own. And I think we should help companies be able to do this. So there's a great opportunity to innovate. There's a great investment opportunity. Melinda Gates and Pivotal Ventures put out a study about 2 months ago, where they showed that the caregiving economic business, that the value of that industry is something on the order of $500 to $600 billion. It is bigger than the entire pharmaceutical industry. So you could actually invest in this business and grow it as it's going to grow, as well as then provide better paying jobs for caregivers, as well as provide, creating jobs that allow somebody else to go to work, which is why it's like doubly stimulative to the economy, which is why it's so good overall for the entire country. And then that will pay more taxes, and then it'll feed more into, there's a virtuous cycle here of how this will benefit everyone if we just make that first upfront investment.
Yeah. I think I want to get back to your story about your mom and how that impacted you. I also think this is a good time for you to take a moment to define some of the terminology that's thrown around policy. As you said, like paid leave, FMLA. We'd love to have some of those words defined for our audience, as I know I still am learning as well.
Yeah. Well, some of the concepts that get kicked around a lot is, let's start with paid leave. We do have something called family medical leave, FMLA, for the Family Medical Leave Act, which was passed back in the Clinton administration. And I've heard President Clinton say it's the bill that he's probably most proud of to actually pass that. But guess what? It's unpaid leave. It guarantees you time off, but only for employers of, that are 50 employees or larger. So there's a whole segment of the small businesses that are not covered by even requiring that they provide unpaid leave for their employees. And, there's types of leave that aren't included, but it does include, medical leave for sick family members, for veterans, for children, for the birth of a child or adoption of a child. But that's all we've had in the United States. We don't have any paid leave. Look, we started the pandemic without any paid national sick leave policy. So literally when the pandemic started, 140 million workers in the United States did not even have the guarantee of a paid sick day off when we started the pandemic. Which is kind of crazy if you think about it, right? So now you got people, because in order to either keep their job or put food on the table for that day for their kids, they're going to work sick. And that's still happening around the country. So, that's so FMLA is unpaid leave. Paid family leave, when we talk about it as advocates, really we want to encompass everything. It's not just maternity leave or paternity leave, which is also frequently talked about as, leave that happens when a child is born or adopted. But we want it to be family leave that happens whether you have a elderly parent that is ill, that needs care, a spouse, perhaps you're married to a veteran who needs long-term care, or you need self-care, that encompasses then pulling in sick leave for, so that you can have self-care that happens. And so that's the kind of leave that we're hoping for. And what the system would do is you would provide, in California, some states have already done it. California's done it. Connecticut have tried to do state level paid leave process where you do, provide a fraction of a penny increase in either the unemployment tax or the Social Security tax to pay into a fund that then will reimburse employers for the wages that they will give to their employees when they give them their wages, and you can reimburse up to 60 or 80% of a worker's wage for, and you can set what the right leave period is. And I think the current proposal is for there to be, 16 weeks of paid leave. So 4 months of paid leave. And you can make it flexible where you could take it all at once. You could take it over a period of time, maybe take it over a period of year. A lot of companies have done this already because it's such a good proposal. Except that, mostly low wage and hourly wage workers don't have access to it. A lot of professionals do, but, actually hourly workers mostly do not. And that's who will benefit. Small businesses who frequently oppose paid leave don't realize they have the most to win at this because they're actually going to get a government subsidy to help subsidize those wages. The big banks, all provide paid leave already because they can afford it. But actually, small businesses will benefit the most from those policies, even as they are the most worried about them. They will actually benefit the most. And then, there's issues of disabled care. We don't talk enough about elder care and disability care enough. And what happens there is, we are overinvested in our Medicaid and Medicare systems to provide disability care in in-home settings like nursing homes, right? But we know actually the majority of folks can and want to stay in their own homes if they had help. But we have very limited and we have caps on the amount of money that can be spent under Medicare and Medicaid for in-home services, which means there are millions of people on waiting lists to get in-home services. And while they're on those waiting lists, if they can't get care, they frequently then go to much more expensive long-term in residential care facilities, which doesn't make any sense, right? It doesn't make economic sense. It doesn't make sense for people's individual care. And so that's why when we talk about the investments in elder care and disabled care that the Biden administration is proposing, we're talking about increasing the resources for that so there aren't waiting lists for those kinds of services.
Heartbreaking when you think about it.
And finally, I just want to mention wage and hour protections. We don't have minimum wage protections for caregivers. And so the average wage for a caregiver right now is less than $10, an hour. And many caregivers hold 2 or 3 different jobs and are living at the poverty line, even as they're doing this really critical care work for the rest of us. And so that is, one of the other proposals is to actually put in wage protections and wage supports for caregivers.
That was a super helpful breakdown. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that was an exceptionally helpful breakdown. What portions of the Biden's proposal specifically are kind of related to helping caregivers? I'm looking right now at a fact sheet, at a White House fact sheet on the overall set of proposals that go in. The one that, and really, I might be looking at the wrong fact sheet, but this one is talking about supporting the health of older Americans. There's a portion of this that looks like it's covering for family caregivers. I think it's $145 million to help family caregivers support their loved ones. That's the part I'm seeing that really relates to caregivers themselves. Are there other portions of what the administration is proposing that address caregivers as well?
Yeah, well, there's so the increases that are proposed for childcare and for elder and disabled care include within them, not just increasing the overall amount, for example, of subsidized childcare slots that are subsidized by federal dollars, but also, includes within that a requirement, for example, that kindergarten level, right, caregivers receive the same wages as kindergarten teachers, so that you're not actually sort of robbing one part of the labor force for another part of the labor force, and to sort of provide, increases there and provide subsidies then for daycare centers and childcare centers to actually provide those increased wages. Right. So, there are various provisions, plugged into as you increase elder and disabled care, making sure that there are wage requirements put into that as well to make sure there's minimum wage protections included and providing the dollars to allow, those wages to go up while not diminishing the amount of services. Because that's often the push-pull is, when you only have a limited amount of dollars, as you pay caregivers more, then there are fewer hours available to subsidize somebody's care. But we have done this at a scarcity model for too long, right? And it's not fair to the caregivers, and it means our loved ones aren't getting the quality care. Here's the other impact, as we, exist in the capitalist economy that we have, because caregiving wages are so low. Let's be clear. That's why those of us who can afford to hire a caregiver can't find them, right? There's so many people right now who aren't looking for subsidized caregiving. They can pay for it, but they still can't find, right, a caregiver for their kids. And that's because we've never invested in caregiving as a profession, as a place where you can make not just a living wage, but you can succeed in and you want to stay in as your profession, which means that for people like me who can afford to hire my own caregiver, I have a hard time finding somebody because nobody wants to do the job. We have not made the job one that we give the due respect and due wages that it deserves to then increase the supply for everyone. So that's another reason why, even if you're not someone who needs subsidized childcare in your life, you should still support the Biden proposal, because by increasing federal supports and public sector support for this industry, we will elevate the entire industry and elevate the entire supply, which we all need. Let's be clear. This is a growth industry. There are 4 million babies born every year in this country. So we need childcare. There are about 4 million of us that turn 65 or older every year.
Right.
And so an increasing number of us need elder care and disabled care. 75% of us, and it's an us because I'm over 65, 75% of us over 65 will need in-home care at some point in our lifetime. In the remaining years we have in our life, 75% of us need this care. And we know this is the boomer generation, so it is growing. So we need to invest in the industry and help it grow so that it will benefit all of us.
Yeah, it seems as if, when you look at the caregiving spectrum this has been so educational for me. I mean, it's been amazing, how educational it's been for me. At least you've got these two, ends of the spectrum, right? You've got children, right, at the one end, and then you've got the elderly at the other end. And I would say that, based on what we've talked about, on how we got here and the folks that we've talked to on how we got here, much of caregiving does focus on the elderly and then on children, right? It amazes me that we haven't come up with something a lot sooner than now, right? But I also agree, and I think what you've pointed out in our conversation today that we've had is that this is a transformative moment. All the things that you have talked about have made this, have really made the case for this being a transformative moment where perhaps we can really make inroads in how we deal with supporting caregiving, not to mention the tons of conversations that we've had with caregivers who are caring for a loved one who is not elderly or a child. Right. Right. In the pandemic, we've dealt with that across the boards, but folks with terminal illnesses, folks with, it's all over. So I really appreciate, both the depth and the breadth of what you've talked about, Tina, so far with us. I think it's critically important. So
yeah. Ditto.
Of course, nobody really cares what I think, but
passing it off to me
Christina.
for a moment. I think as we're launching out this conversation about investing in caregiver compensation, what are your thoughts on getting family caregivers paid specifically, as well as alleviating, finding solutions to alleviate care costs, so that it isn't such a costly expense for an individual who is caring for a loved one?
Well, we absolutely need to do that. One of the things, the other way to think about caregiving that, other countries do, but we do not, is to understand that, caregiving is like a public utility, right? It is something that we all need at some point in our lives to have, that is essential to make our economy run. I often say when we talk about, infrastructure investment, if you want to invest in that road or bridge to get people to go to work, they cannot get out of their house to drive across that road or bridge to the job unless they've got caregiving at home first. So you've got to have that investment. And we need to start seeing caregiving as this public utility that we all will need at some point in our time. We may need assistance in paying for it or accessing it. In France, they have a network across the country of childcare centers, which, my sister lives there and she used to live in the south of France. And when we would travel up to Paris, she could put her kids into the Paris childcare center for the day, if that's what she needed to do the work she needed to do in Paris for that day. Because they recognize this is a public good that needs to be invested in. So that's one thing we need to do to invest in, to sort of bring down the cost and increase access. We need to provide, a way. The Biden proposal is that, for low and medium wage income, folks, that they will not pay more than 7% of their own income on childcare. Right now in some states, it is more costly to put a child into childcare than it is to send a child to college.
Wow.
Right? That's impossible for young families. You may save up over your entire working career to get your kid to college, but when that kid is a baby, you haven't saved up for that. And now all of a sudden you're having to pay, 30, 40, 50% of your wages on childcare. And even still, while you're doing that, that caregiver in the child care center may only be getting minimum wage. So we do need to provide, again, that's an investment that the public sector can make, in offsetting the capital costs for opening a child care center, alleviating some of the regulatory burden that child care centers, have, while maintaining safety, for kids. Having, like I said, private sector investment, I think there's a real opportunity here for innovation, to actually make this a more seamless, accessible. Folks like care.com are already trying to do that, right? Being able to match caregivers to, folks seeking care. We need to sort of do more of that. And also recognize, and provide systems, that allow for people. I think, Bill, you were kind of, alluding to this, you don't always need the same form of care all the time, right? Sometimes it's episodic. Sometimes, you get an acute episode of COVID that lasts for, 2 months and you need the caregiving, and then you need to come up. Well, that's really hard to find, right? Can we come up with better ways of matching part-time caregiving with part-time caregivers, that allows for access? Again, I think there's a real opportunity here for an industry that has been underinvested in, has not had the innovation applied to it that has been applied to the delivery of packages.
Right.
If we could deliver packages overnight, I kind of think we can come up.
Well, I mean, we're dropping them in people's yards from drones now, so it's kind of like, right. So, how do you make that go with it? I have quite a bit of experience when I was in, because I've been in executive management before and have managed teams as a manager, and while it seems very complicated to manage the part-time aspect of caregiving, that happens because we have something, in business called intermittent FMLA, or intermittent FMLA.
Right.
Sometimes that can be a little bit hard to manage. The fact of the matter is it can be managed. I've done it. And it can be managed well. And you can have people who get better, or their family members get better or whatever, and return to work and everything is hunky-dory. It involves an investment, I think, that sometimes folks may not be willing to make, as managers to really care about what's going on with their employees and figure it out, right? So if I know that I'm going to have a staff member who's going to be out, for intermittent leave for some reason, how do I cover that? And how do I, it takes an investment on the part of that manager in their folks to work it out, right? And it leads to a question that I know Christina usually asks, but I want to ask because I think it's kind of an underlying thing here. Yeah, do you know where I'm going with this? Good. I'm glad you do. Because it's been questionable with me the entire session. How do we create a more caring society? How do we get down to the level where people actually think about the idea that, I can serve somebody else by providing care or making it possible for them to provide care?
Mm-hmm. Well, I do think there's some shifts that we have to make, and I'm not sure I've got the answer to the meta problem, but
I'm sorry. Yeah.
More micro levels. Let me give you an example. So there are a lot of companies right now that do have, right, some form of paid leave on the books, but a lot of times they don't take it, or women take it and men don't, even if they have, a non-gendered, policy. And that's because, if you've got a paid leave policy on the books, and let's say it's 3 months, most of the time the worker comes to you and asks for it, or has to ask, or say, I don't really need 3 months, I'll come back, in 4 weeks. And, that's actually looked at as like a good thing, right? Like the fewer amount of time the people, that's why you've got people who are, I've heard of stories, I just recently heard another one, law firms have had 3 months of paid leave for a long time, for decades, since my children were little and my kids are in their 20s and 30s. And yet there's always the stories of the woman who's on the phone going into labor, negotiating the deal as she's like,
right.
And I know some of those people. I actually know some of those people. Because the what we viewed as the thing that we're rewarding, right, is taking them on a leave. Well, what if you flipped the reward system? What if you flipped it and as a manager, as the person running the company, you said, my expectation is whenever somebody has these sets of life events, birth of a child, death of a family member, illness, you have the expectation is you will take the full amount of leave. So somebody's going to have a child, man or woman. The expectation is they will take 3 months. You plan around that, to your point, Bill, so that you actually know that's going to happen. Not that you're waiting for the person to have the conversation with you. So you don't know if it's going to be a week and you don't know if it's going to be 3 months. You know when they tell you, I'm pregnant, I'm going to, or my wife is pregnant, we're going to take, I've got my 3 months as we're due in this month. So the 3 months is going to start here. You can start planning and make that the default and make the explanation be not like how many of your workers were out, so how much absenteeism you'd have, but like, all right, you had 5 people who were out on leave and they didn't take the full time. Now explain to me why they didn't take the full time. Because our expectation is everybody takes the full time.
Right.
And you get the demerits, right? If your people are not taking the full time as opposed to the way it currently works, right? Make it the default and make people explain, right? The deviation from the norm being you take it as opposed to the current norm being people are absent as little as possible. And what that will do is it also means we've got to, and this is a little bit of the way our capitalist system work is we're too focused on short-term gain, right? As opposed to long-term investment.
Right.
We have to start thinking about human resources as a long-term investment, just like you invest in a big piece of machinery. You don't expect that piece of machinery to pay off, right? In the first quarter after you buy it, you depreciate it over time. You need to invest in your employees and see the payoff over time when that person who went out on leave comes back with all the retained knowledge that, oh, by the way, you trained them on for the 5 years they worked for you before they went out for their baby. Don't you want to see the return on that investment when they come back after 3 months and still have that retained knowledge, still have the connections to clients, still knows how to sell your product, still knows how to write your code, right? And do that. And in the long run, that it will be much more profitable than if you lose that person because you're not providing this leave and you're going to start all over again with somebody who doesn't know your clients, doesn't know how your product works, doesn't know the geography of where they're living in, so how to go around and do the sales. And that we have not really viewed human resources that way. We've really viewed it as a cost to be managed. All workers are fungible. It doesn't matter if people leave. I think in a knowledge economy, that paradigm has shifted. It's not so easy to train somebody how to write your new code for your pretty complicated, sophisticated technology system as it was to just teach somebody how to, run the stamping machine on a shop floor.
Yes. Wow.
Yeah.
Yep.
And I was going to say, not to mention the skills you learn while caring too, the time management skills and everything else.
No, that, Christine, is another important point, is that we tend to, if you find out somebody's a mother, they get discounted, even though it's illegal to take this into account. But you sort of take it as you're hiring somebody, is to actually value multitasking, to realize that people who are parents or people who are managing the care of an elderly parent or someone else as great at multitasking. And in this fast-paced world, right, where stuff is coming at you all the time because of the internet, no matter what business you're in, you're having to manage global demands as well as, you're going to have to deal with Asia in the off hours. Who better than a new parent to know how to work during the night as well as during the day, when half of your business is on a different time zone. And to value that multitasking experience of someone who, their whole person, there's a little bit like that, allow people to bring their whole person to work. It isn't just about how they show up as an Asian, right, or as a woman. It is also about how they show up as a caregiver, how they show up as a single working mom, how they show up and are able to bring all of those skills to bear in your business and to value that, right, and to celebrate it and to make it easier for them to do that, because in the long run, you will benefit as a business.
Absolutely.
I was a member, or I was part of a large Catholic healthcare system here in the U.S. for 22 years, and their president, who was Sister Mary Jean Ryan, 15 years ago, was talking to us, his leadership, about the leadership that needed to be developed within the teams, within the employees, whether they were housekeepers or programmers or nurses or doctor or whatever, that the concept was that, look, these folks, whoever they are the CEOs of their own households, right? They're the CEO, CFO, COO. They're the folks who run this, and we need to give them credit for that and understand that they are that type of leader in their own environment at home. We need to understand that as they are in the workplace, and we need to allow them to bring those skills and talents into the workplace as leaders. That was really the core of her message, and I think that what you've said just mirrors that so closely, and I'm glad to hear it. Beyond the walls of where I had worked. So I think that's wonderful.
Well, I know we've gone over our hour time, and there's inevitably,
we have.
I think there were a couple times where I was like, I want to ask you this follow up, but first, so I guess we're just going to have you on again.
Happy to come
Wonderful.
back.
We appreciate that. So as we wrap up this conversation, I think a great place to end is, what message do you have right now to caregivers who might be listening to the podcast? What would you like to say to them?
Well, my message is, I just want to reiterate what we talked about earlier. We are at a critical moment. Caregiving is in the national conversation in ways that it has never been before. But it's not going to stay in the national conversation unless we make that happen, and as caregivers, your story, your experience, what you're living through today or what you've lived through in the past is critical to be heard. So use your voice, whether it's locally with your local elected leaders or, the local employers that you have, or write an op-ed or post something, on Twitter. Again, you can use the hashtag CareCan'tWait, and that'll, put you into the conversation with the Care Can't Wait Coalition.
Which I love, by the way.
Online.
That's great.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And you can look, you can be part of that, Caring Across Generations or Moms Rising, or, the SEIU, which is the union that represents a lot of caregivers, are all very active on all of this. Reach out to any of them and make your voice heard. And right now is the moment. Definitely call your member of Congress, or send them an email and let them know that you care about caregiving, and it will make a huge difference right now.
The other hashtag you didn't mention was "It's time to care."
Yes,
which I also really, really like. So, excellent.
Yeah. Well, with that, is there anything we missed? How can people find you and talk to you?
Well, I am, at Chen Tina, at Tina Tchen, on Twitter, at Chen Tina on Instagram, and would love, happy to engage with folks, on that, and, also on LinkedIn at Tina Tchen, I think is it, TCHEN, which is, like a whole other story from my dad, but, this is silent T at the start of my last name. So.
Absolutely.
So I just want to thank you so much, Tina, for being on here with us today. And like I tried to poorly express earlier, I had tried to make some connections between the issues that you were dealing with when you were at Time's Up with women in the workplace and sexual harassment, all of that, and where the caregiving piece fit into that. I'm really glad that we have you as a voice for caregivers, because I think that, I know the focus here for you is a lot on women, as it should be, because I think there's still so much that needs to be done there. But I also know that voice extends to all caregivers as well, or at least I hope I can put those words in your mouth.
No, absolutely. This is something that, look, women are disproportionately affected because we are more disproportionately caregivers, but You are absolutely right. It affects the entire family. It affects,
Well,
we have a substantial number of men who are caregivers or who need care. As well as, trans, brothers and sisters,
right.
this is an issue
Yeah.
that really knows no boundaries. And doesn't recognize socioeconomic boundaries as well.
Well, and it doesn't recognize race either. And the other thing that I took
only in the negative sense, in that
Right.
we have a disproportionate number of caregivers who are Black and brown,
Right.
and Black and brown women, which is why we need to invest in them. And the link, just to close the loop for folks, back to sexual harassment, which we worked so hard to combat at Time's Up, is we at Time's Up was working not only to stand up for survivors and against sexual harassment when it happens, but to also work for a world where it doesn't happen in the first place. And to do that, you need to build safe, fair, and equitable workplaces. And that only happens when we know that we've got more women and LGBTQ and people of color and disabled workers, up and down the wage scale. And caregiving right now is one of the biggest barriers keeping that from happening. So that's how all the dots connect, is that if we don't solve this caregiving crisis, and we see it right now, we're going to have fewer women, fewer people of color, fewer low-wage workers who are able to succeed in the workplace, which means, the kinds of white patriarchal systems that, discriminate, harass, workers, they're going to persist. And that's why you need structural change, in our workplaces, as well as attitudinal change. And caregiving is one of those structural changes that needs to happen.
Absolutely. Well said. I have to say that Chris would be very happy that you both touched on the piece of caregiving, knowing no bounds. Caregiving, he always says that. So I'm glad you brought it full circle that way too, without realizing that. So thank you again.
Another keen set of insights.
Keen insight number 3.
Keen insight like number 15, not on my part.
Yeah.
Okay.
We've accumulated a lot of keen insights today.
Yes, we have. I think we have.
Yeah.
I think we have, which I'm really glad we can share with the listeners.
Yeah, me too. Thank you again, Tina. My individual thank you being, again, going into this conversation, I was expecting to be educated, and I was. So thank you for making me more knowledgeable on this subject, because this will help me as I serve the caregiving.com community, just learn to be the best in my role there as well. So.
Right. And me as the producer of podcasting. I mean, I got out of healthcare IT and decided not to continue to pursue it in part, with the purpose of doing things that I feel are more meaningful in my life at this stage in my life. And, this entire subject matter around caregiving, and many of the other things you touched on, are really, really important to me personally. So the work that I do in producing podcasts is about trying to make sure that we're cutting through a lot of the static that we hear, particularly when it comes to issues like this, which are so heavily politicized. That we're cutting through that, and that message is clear. And I think we've accomplished that today. So I am just so pleased to meet you. I'm fan guy. Okay.
Fan guy over there.
I'm fan guy.
Well, thank you for having me. I enjoyed it. It was a great conversation.
Well, with that, we just have a little outro that we're going to go through here, Tina, and then we will stop the recording. So if you don't mind, I will kick us off with that. So thanks to Tina for joining us again. How We Got Here is produced and edited by Bill Oddman of Oddvox Productions. So that guy that you were hearing the whole time, very pleased to have him on with this interview with me today.
And social media is by the one and only Christina Best, and designs by Michelle Lacouture.
That sounded so beautiful the way you said it. How We Got Here is a production of caregiving.com and the Whole Care Network, and we are sponsored by Anthem.
We are on social media at _HWGH pod on Instagram and Twitter.
And I just have to say, Bill, you did a great job. Knocked it out of the park.
Now, that's in the script. So really, what do you think?
No, honestly.
Really, what do you think?
I loved it. So thank you so much for filling in today. Couldn't have asked for a better co-host with this conversation.
I enjoyed it, and I personally love being the wild card.
Mm-hmm.
So I was glad to do it again with you. And Tina. Yes. Poor Tina. Oh, my gosh.
No, it was great. It was great.
Well, with that, we will be back, as always, with another episode next Tuesday. Thanks for joining us.